What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this Saturday video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Before we get started today as well, I want to remind all of you, I invite you to also subscribe to a brand new channel that I've started with former Lucchese mobster, Frank Gioia Jr. The trailer is out now and content will begin very soon. Make sure you subscribe. The link to that is in the pinned comment of this video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And just because you join the mafia and you get old doesn't mean that life ends for you. We have seen men like Sonny Franzese far into the years of their twilight still committing crimes and being a gangster. The truth of the matter is, no matter what some of these individuals tell you here on YouTube, like John Gotti Jr. and Michael Franzese, you're never retired in that life. And today we're going to talk about an old timer, an individual who lived that life until the end. And the end was 101 years old. The story of Albert Chinky Facchiano next on the Sit Down. Now, a lot of you probably have never heard of Facchiano, but he remains to me, in all of the looks that I've had into the mafia, one of the more interesting, lesser known characters of all time. Albert Facchiano was born on March 10th, way back in 1910 in New York City. His family would live in the Bronx. In fact, the family, at least in his early years, lived at on 154th Street in the South Bronx. Now, Facchiano's family, his father, Antonio, and his mother came over in 1901, and they had quite a big family. What's interesting about Facchiano is that in 1910, when he was born, his father was 53 years old, according to census data. Now, my thought was maybe this was just a misprint. However, in the 1930 census, when Chinky was 20 years old, his father was listed as 73 years old. Now, that is obviously quite old to have a child. I guess it's not out of the question. One thing I learned about Facchiano's family is that both his mother and father were old. His mother at the time of his birth was 43 years old. And by the time he was born, they had already had 5 children. And he was one of the youngest that they had. Now, from the looks of it, it seemed like the Facchianos had trouble making ends meet. Eventually, by 1930, they lived at 846 Morris Avenue in the Bronx, not far from Yankee Stadium. From what we know about Facchiano, by the 7th grade, so we can venture to believe by 1925, Facchiano was already out of school. He had quit, and he began looking for work. As I said, his father was quite old by that point and really had never really provided. From all that I found about Facchiano's father, he was just kind of a laborer that worked odd jobs. At one point, he had a job with the city water department, but he pretty much struggled. And even into his twilight years, his own father was working. At 73, it said he still had odd jobs around the area. Now, as far as we know about Facchiano, by 1930, it was listed that he was a trucker working for some sort of company in the New York area. And from what I understand, by into the 40s, he was still doing that. And that's where I think he gained his criminal element. But he was arrested far before that. By 1930, Facchiano would be arrested on charges of the R word. Now, obviously, I can't talk and get into detail, but there's little known about this. The only thing we do know is that Facchiano was charged in 1930 at the age of 20, and eventually that charge was thrown out and he was cleared of it. So we're ventured to believe that he didn't participate in that and it never happened. That said, he would be arrested again in 1932 on charges of grand larceny and robbery, and this would happen out of Pittsburgh. Now, my thought is that Facchiano in his trucking career likely got involved with hijacking or receiving stolen goods. And he just happened to be out there doing some traveling and doing some work, and he got jammed up. It was said that he served approximately 2 years in prison for that crime. Now, Facchiano, again, would be arrested in 1936 for another charge involving grand larceny, and then in 1944 for bookmaking. By 1950, at the age of 30, Mr. Facchiano would again move and live in the Bronx at 375 East 160th Street in the Bronx. By that time, he had married a woman called Peggy. Now, by 1950, it's believed that Facchiano has already become involved with organized crime. Now, I don't know his exact initiation date due to the fact that before the books closed in 1960, records weren't kept at a super high level, and I wasn't able to find making ceremonies that had Facchiano in them, but it is believed that he was made in either the 40s or early 50s. One thing we do know is he was identified as a member pre-1963. So Facchiano, by that point, was a soldier. Now, his early criminal partners, as far as I know, and from things that we know about Facchiano, one of his main partners was a person called Gregory John Ardito, a.k.a. Buster Ardito. Now, Buster Ardito became a high-ranking member of the Genovese family down the road. Now, again, when Facchiano was made, and if he was close to Ardito, it's possible that early in his life, he may have been in the large Manhattan crew of Mike Miranda. Now, Miranda had, I believe, hundreds of soldiers. He had one of the biggest crews in the Genovese family in the 50s and in the 60s. So it is possible that Facchiano was part of that crew. Though, as far as we know about Facchiano, by the 60s, he was actually advised and instructed to go to Florida to grow the family's rackets in the Sunshine State, which is exactly what he did. Not only did Facchiano, as a soldier, grow the growing bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion trades down in South Florida, but he started jumping into shaking down large companies, unions, that sort of thing, and started making inroads in the Sunshine State. That said, by 1979, the federal government would catch up with Albert Facchiano. He was hit with an extortion case out of the state of Alabama, which, again, the one thing I learned about Facchiano is in his years as a mobster, he never rose above soldier. He also never rose above 5'6". This guy was a little guy. He was an old codger, he was called, like an old timer who, was a tough bulldog type of guy. And he moved around. I mean, he caught cases out of Pittsburgh. He caught cases out of Florida. He caught cases out of Alabama. Now, not a lot's known about his federal case out of Alabama. All we know is he was arrested on extortion charges. This would happen again in 1979. And eventually he was hit with 25 years in federal prison. Now, that seems like a lot, but remember, in the early 80s, there was still parole. So Facchiano wasn't going to be there that long. He was probably only going to do like 5, 7, 8 years. That said, during his incarceration, his name would come up in kind of a wild way. Eventually, in the early 80s, as we know, Ronald Reagan would become the president, and the individual that he would institute as labor secretary was a person called Raymond Donovan, seen on the left with Reagan on Air Force One. Raymond Donovan at one point became kind of a titan of industry. He was a 50% partner in a company called Schiavone Construction Company. Eventually, he caught multiple corruption cases, one of which involved being involved in organized crime. And guess whose name pops up? Albert Facchiano. According to what we know, Schiavone Contracting and Construction had a large inroad in Florida. They were doing a lot of big-time construction projects in and around Miami. So Facchiano, alongside another person called William Maselli, also a Genovese mobster, they go and attempt to shake down Raymond Donovan for no-show jobs. And if you don't know what a no-show job is, it's essentially a job given to someone through corruption and through organized crime. And basically, they sit around all day and collect a paycheck. You may have seen it in shows like The Sopranos, which is shown there. Now, Facchiano's never hit with any additional charges. And according to Raymond Donovan, who was under investigation, he declined ever knowing Facchiano or Miceli. That said, it is possible that they likely tried to shake him down and may have even been successful in getting some sort of kickback or no-show job. That said, Facchiano would finish out his prison term. Now, before we continue, if you'd like to support this channel further, make sure you hit that super thanks icon below the video. It helps the channel grow and become more and more successful. So if you like what we're doing, hit that thanks button underneath the video. In 1987, Facchiano would be released from federal prison. Lucky for him, parole is still around, and he ends up doing about an 8-year bid in federal prison. And guess what? He heads right back to Florida and right back to the streets, operating in a crew that had taken over South Florida. Facchiano would live most of his later life in Hallandale Beach, Florida, which is famous due to the fact that it's a suburb of Miami, but is also home to Gulfstream Park Racetrack, which is one of the bigger racetracks as far as horse racing in the country. So we're going to guess that Facchiano spent a bunch of time around Gulfstream over the years. Now, remember, in 1987, Facchiano is 77 years old. He was born in 1910. You would think he'd come home. He just did an 8-year stretch in prison. Maybe that 77, I'm going to just take my money, go to Gulfstream every day, and hang out. But with Facchiano, that did not happen. He would head right back to the streets and begin operating in a crew led by a person called Reinaldi Ruggiero. Now, Ruggiero is not a very well-known Genovese member, but he would head a crew. He was made captain of a crew in the early 2000s in the West Palm Beach area. Reinaldi Ruggiero operated out of a restaurant, get this, called Sopranos in West Palm Beach. And he had a bunch of soldiers and associates under him that ran everything from bookmaking to loan sharking. And one of the operations that was under Ruggiero was a bookmaking and loan sharking crew overseen by Albert Facchiano. Now, Facchiano would remain in that role and eventually face heat because of it, though he would travel back to New York on a regular basis. And in the early 2000s, he would regularly have meals and drinks with old members of the family, including Joseph Zito and Sammy Meatballs Aparo. And this is where an infamous conversation happens between Facchiano, Joe Zito, and Sammy Meatballs. Now, remember, Zito at one point was acting boss of the Genovese crime family. And these guys had all known each other over the years, and they would, reminisce about the old days, the days of Tony Salerno and Vincent Gigante. And at one point, Zito is talking to Facchiano. And remember, one of the ways we know this is due to FBI agent Mike Campi, who was interviewed by this show here. He talks about this conversation that's wiretapped, where Zito essentially tells Facchiano that at their age, in their 80s and 90s, we shouldn't be out handling, hits. We should give that to the younger guys. We need to, not retire, but take more of a back seat. Facchiano would stop Zito with a word quote, "You're never retired." He also would then insist to Zito that if murders needed to be committed, that he should be called upon to do them. Think about that. This is an individual that was born in 1910. We're in 2001. He's in his 90s, and he's sitting at a table. Think about him firing a gun. He would likely fall over. But this is what I'm talking about, and this is why I've always said, in 20 years from now, I don't believe the mafia can withstand people like this dying. They're just not made like this anymore. It's rare that you see this. And a lot of the time, guys retire. But this individual knew that the one thing he was good at, the one thing that his calling was, it wasn't to be a cop, it wasn't to be a doctor, It was to be a gangster. And this is the thing that the Cosa Nostra had ran on for years. Many people like this, that this is the end right here. And this is why I think John Gotti is so revered, because make no punches, he was who he was. And there was two ways out: prison or the grave. And until you get to that point, like Facchiano said, you're never retired. Now, Facchiano would continue to operate in South Florida in the mid 2000s. That said, in 2006, he would be indicted on two different indictments, one of which was out of New York, involving allegedly intimidating or attempting to intimidate a federal witness. According to what we know, and according to a wired up CI, Peter Peluso, he would say, and the wiretap would state, that alongside Facchiano and Buster Ardito, who, remember, Ardito by this point is 85 years old, Facchiano is 95 years old, they allegedly went in 2005 and attempted to shake down a federal witness known only as Witness 5. We don't know who that is, but they basically think that he's a rat, and they attempt to quiet him. So remember, they're in their 90s doing this sort of thing. Now, at one point, Ardito states on wiretap to Peter Peluso, quote, "Yeah, two hitmen, me and Chinky, 95 years old. I tell you, if we pull the trigger, we would have fell on the floor." And they're not wrong. But these are gangsters, and this is what they were instructed to do. And they went and did it. Now, also, Facchiano was indicted out of Florida on extortion charges in reference to his involvement in running a loan sharking, bookmaking, and extortion ring out of West Palm and Hallandale. At the time he was indicted, he was 96 years old. And this caught national news. I saw papers from North Carolina to Vancouver, Washington, or Vancouver, Canada, to all over the place discussing this guy's 96, 97 years old, and he's still at it. Eventually, though, for Facchiano, he did get some luck using a cane and with a headset for hearing issues. He would plead guilty at the age of 97 in 2007 to racketeering, and the judge would spare him. He would give him 6 months house arrest and 18 months of supervised release. At the sentencing, Facchiano would tell the judge, quote, that he was sorry for his crimes and that he would never get mixed up anymore, and that his days in that life are over. Albert Facchiano would die in 2011 at the age of 101 years old. As I've said before, it's pretty rare that anybody gets to the age of 90. It's really rare to get to 95, and it's extremely rare to get to 100. Facchiano did it, and he was a gangster to the end. Whenever you have people like this, and they eventually all start dying out, the same morals, ethics, and values aren't there anymore. And this is why we've continued to see organized crime continue to die and die and die. And eventually, it'll be extinct due to the fact that people like this are gone. Now, in normal lives, people like this should not be celebrated. But in this circle, we have to almost respect this guy. This is what he was, and he would be that until the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.